We are very delighted to host this program in partnership with Pew Research Center. Many of us in academia have told Richard many times that we make frequent references to and we cite your research, and it is one of the very few, in fact, global opinion polls that we feel confident citing in our work because of its rigor, because of its independent analysis. And the Global Attitudes research provides a very important context in which that we discuss the role of soft power in international affairs. So today's event is anchored around the publication of a special issue of the Hague Journal of Diplomacy on the future of soft power and public diplomacy, which my colleague from Leiden University in Klingendale in the Netherlands, Jan Melissen, we're very glad that Jan is joining us, and Jan and I co-edited, and it just came out. The 12 essays collected in this volume by some of the leading scholars and also emerging voices seek to reflect on some of the developments in this field, specifically in the context of the global information sphere that presents challenges for public diplomacy practitioners and indeed for academic analysis in the years ahead. If any consensus exists among the authors in this collection, it is that the present state of affairs constitutes a crisis which is above all fomented by resurgent geopolitical rivalry and the technological changes we're witnessing that are impacting our international politics and also state-society relations, and of course on the practice of public diplomacy. We believe that this special issue provides a much-needed update on the literature and also provides us a better sense of where public diplomacy is going next. Generally speaking, as we all agree, that for governments and foreign ministries, there is less and less diplomacy without at least some element of public diplomacy, thus making the distinction of the boundaries between what is public diplomacy less relevant. And for other actors of a growing consequence in a global system, including subnational actors, international institutions, multinational businesses, civil society organizations, for instance, public diplomacy principles and tools provide a valuable framework for their international interactions. So this special issue ranges from a fundamental discussion of what soft power principle of public diplomacy principles to the challenges of deep-rooted Westphalian perspectives of culture. It also includes examinations of public diplomacy's contribution to countering extremist violence and relations with hostile nations, as well as an argument on human behavior driving the sharp power campaigns that oftentimes turn our traditional public diplomacy practices upside down. And we also have contributions from scholars on the impact of new technologies on the practice, on the organizational processes, and so on. And new thinking, new concepts that appreciates the important widening of social and political actors and communities beyond state boundaries, and attention for the effects of the populist turn in a contemporary politics. So I hope that you all check out this special issue. It's currently it's available through many libraries. Check with if you're university-based, check with your library and see if you have a subscription to that. But there will be a paperback that's coming out very soon, so it will be available through I guess the usual channels of the book selling. So all of these articles were written by academics. Therefore, we're looking from outside in, right, rather than reflecting or extrapolating based on personal experiences. Therefore, today's program is all the more meaningful as we bring the community practice into this conversation. Bridging the study-practice gap is a core mission of the USC Center on Public Diplomacy. We do that in our research. We do that through convening discussions like this, and we do that in our professional training programs. To advance the field of public diplomacy, bringing academics or practitioners together in this type of forum is, of course, essential, but it is not enough. We must also bring in the funders to the table, to the discussions like this kind going forward. And we need thoughtful, creative dialogue engagement with our concerned citizens, as well as philanthropic organizations on the importance of improving international communication and global security, which is at the heart of public diplomacy. So at CPD, it is our top priority, one of our top priorities, to find ways to mobilize societal resources to broaden the community of support for public diplomacy. And we welcome your ideas as we work toward convening discussions like this with the participation of not only academics, practitioners, but also funders, so that we can truly advance this enterprise and to take public diplomacy work to the next level. So to kick off today's program, here's a surprise. We did not announce this. Joseph Nye, of course you know, who coined the term soft power, and is one of the contributors to this special issue. He would like to share his video remarks with us because he cannot make it today in person. And so afterwards, Richard will present some of the data from Pew Research that's relevant to today's conversation by a panel of several authors who have contributed to our special issue. So thank you very much. So let's first watch Joseph Nye's video remarks.
Good morning. It's a pleasure to be with you to celebrate this special issue of the Hague Journal on public diplomacy. Indeed, I feel honored to be included in such a special issue. It's also a pleasure to be with you in absentia, even though I can't be there in purpose, to celebrate with CPD, which has a long-standing role as a leader in the area of public diplomacy. So despite the fact that I can't be physically present, I wanted to be able to send my best wishes and join in the celebration. Public diplomacy is certainly more important than ever. And what we find is that in this information age, something that John Aquila wrote a couple of decades ago is probably more true than even when he first wrote it, which is that when you ask in political contests traditionally who would win, the answer was the side with the biggest army would win. But in today's world, sometimes it's the side with the best story that wins. And that ability to get that story out, to be able to explain things, to affect people's minds is crucial. We often say that swords determine outcomes, but it's minds that determine the hands that wield the swords. So in that sense, I think when we look at the information age that we're in, and how it's been burgeoning with this extraordinary growth of the internet and cyber activities, you can see that more people have more information than ever before, and that means that the ability to reach those people through public diplomacy becomes even more important. Now, I am sad to say that the American government in its current incarnation has not been exactly enamored of soft power or the ability to attract rather than coerce and pay, and it has not invested very heavily in public diplomacy. Indeed, President Trump's budget director and chief of staff, Mick Mulvaney, once said that he wanted a hard power budget, not a soft power budget. In that sense, I think we're seeing some of the results when you look at what's happened to American soft power as measured by polls around the world. That's gone down quite considerably since the period of since 2017. There is some hope, if you want, which is that there have been periods in the past where American attractiveness and soft power have been very low, and during the Vietnam War, people were marching through the streets in opposition to American government policy. The interesting thing to note was that they were not singing the Communist Internationale, but Martin Luther King's "We Shall Overcome." In other words, an anthem from American civil society was providing a basis for soft power, even when the American government was following policies which seemed to be undercutting that soft power. And we may hope that there'll be a period like this again in which after we move to our 46th president, whenever that may be, that there'll be a restoration of American soft power because it depends not just on government but also on civil society. But in the meantime, we could hope that we would see more of an investment in public diplomacy, a public diplomacy which will depend very much on credibility, not propaganda. As somebody once said, the best propaganda is not propaganda. It's interactions and two-way conversations and flows. And I think that's the challenge for public diplomacy today, is how to reach that vast new audience in ways that are different from in the past. That's going to take some imagination, but it goes back to the point I mentioned earlier that public diplomacy is more important than ever. And in that sense, I'm just delighted to be part of this new special issue of the Hague Journal of Diplomacy, because I think it is attracting the right people to the right target, and I wish you all well in your celebrating this very important special issue. Thank you.
All right, well, great to hear from Professor Nye. He's someone, of course, is probably influenced about everybody in this room with his work, so that's terrific to hear from him. As we said, what I'll plan to do is maybe just walk through a few slides that highlight some of the research that we've done here at the Pew Research Center over the years that I think is relevant to some of the discussions that we'll have here tonight. In reading the introduction to the special edition of the journal that Jay and Jan wrote, I was struck by their discussion around how the changing information space globally is creating challenges for public diplomacy, and in particular, a couple of the changes that you mentioned, technological challenges, as well as geopolitical challenges. So what I'll do maybe is share with you a little bit of data we have on views about technological change, views about geopolitical shifts, and then also some data we've collected over time about soft power, and in particular, the soft power of the United States. So let's start off with a recent survey that we did that looks at some issues around technology. And this was a survey in 11 emerging and developing countries around the world. And we explored a whole bunch of issues about mobile technology and social media. So if you look over here on the left side of the slide, these are all median percentages, by the way, across those 11 countries that we polled. What we found is that 78% of the people we surveyed said that access to mobile phones, the internet, and social media are making people more informed about current events. They also said that all these technological changes are making it easier to manipulate people with false information and rumors. We also asked people who use social media whether they frequently or occasionally see articles that introduce new ideas to them that seem obviously false or untrue, or that make people feel negatively about other groups of people. And as you can see, we get a majority saying that they do encounter articles that do all of those things. So I think if you add all this up, people feel like they're being educated in some ways by these new platforms and these new sources of information, but they're also worried about false information, and they're also worried about how these platforms might be sharing information that creates more divisions in society. So, of course, there's a lot of debate about social media right now and its impact on politics, its impact on society. And what we see in our surveys around the world is that average citizens care about those same issues, and they're having those same debates. These are not just issues among elites. These are problems and opportunities that average citizens see as well. So that's technological change. Let me talk just a little bit about what we see in terms of public perceptions around the world regarding geopolitical change. This is data from a survey we conducted last year in 25 countries around the world. And again, these percentages are all median percentages across those 25 countries. And what we did was we read people a list of 7 different nations. And for each one of those, we asked them whether they think that country is playing a more important, less important, or as important role in world affairs compared to 10 years ago. And when we do that, essentially China's the winner, right? 7 in 10 people across these countries we surveyed say China is playing a more important role in world affairs. The only other country where you had a clear plurality even of people saying that it's playing a more important role is Russia. People also, on balance, see Russia playing a larger role in world affairs. And of course, you can see what we found regarding some of the other countries that we asked about as well. If there's sort of a loser among the 7, it's post-Brexit or involved in Brexit UK. We had 3 in 10 across these countries saying that the UK is playing a less important role in world affairs. But China and Russia are seen as growing in power. It doesn't always mean people like that, right? And you can see a little bit of that here in this slide. We asked about Xi Jinping, we asked about Putin. They get largely negative ratings across these countries. 56% said they lacked confidence in Xi, 62% said they lacked confidence in Putin. However, they did not get the most negative ratings on our survey. That distinction belongs to President Trump. 70% across these countries said they lacked confidence in Trump. The China Daily wrote articles about this survey, and their takeaway was that Xi was more popular than Trump. They didn't really cover the fact that he didn't get good ratings overall, but he did beat Trump on this rating, and that was China Daily's sort of hook for their story. The most popular leaders are Angela Merkel, Emmanuel Macron, sort of the upholders at this point, if you will, of the liberal world order actually get the highest ratings. But we do see negative ratings for President Trump. It's something that we've seen in our surveys over the last couple of years, and what we've also seen is that that his low ratings are having an effect on overall attitudes towards the United States. So to illustrate that, I'm just going to share with you some data from one country we've surveyed a lot over the years, Germany. So you can see our trend line on confidence in the American president going back for 3 presidencies now. So it's been a pretty interesting story with lots of ups and downs. If you look at President Bush's numbers in Germany when he started out his presidency, they were pretty good, in positive territory. Obviously, the Iraq War was a factor. Key elements of his foreign policy were unpopular in Germany and much of Europe, and his numbers declined over the course of his 2 terms in office. President Obama comes into office. He's very popular in Germany. He gets these extraordinarily high numbers, more than 90% confidence in him early in his time in office. They decline a little bit in 2014. Turns out we were listening in on Angela Merkel's phone conversations. That didn't help a lot. But they bounced back after that. He's very popular when he leaves office. You can see the numbers for President Trump quite low over the last couple of years. Similar to the Bush numbers, actually, at the end of his second term. I think the dynamics behind those numbers might be a little bit different, but the numbers are similar. And then you can see this kind of light green trend line as well. And that's the percentage of people in Germany with a favorable opinion of the United States. And they move very closely in parallel with one another, right? There's obviously other things affecting the favorability measure, but it's clear too that who's in the White House, the policies that the president follows have a big impact on overall ratings for the United States and Germany, and we see similar patterns in many, many other countries that we survey. At the same time, we know that the president isn't the only factor that influences how people think about the United States. So I wanted to share some other kind of elements of American soft power with you that we've asked about over the time. So this is data from 2017 survey, so our first survey of the Trump era. Median percentages across 37 countries we polled that year. And, people still essentially liked the American people. 58% across those countries said they had a favorable opinion of the American people. People also said they liked American popular culture, American movies and music and television. So those remain sort of strong suits of American soft power, even at a time when people were pretty unhappy with other aspects of the United States, particularly the president and some of his policies. Now, we've also seen over time a kind of flip side of that culture question, right? This is where we ask people, is it a good thing or a bad thing that American ideas and customs are spreading here? And when we ask people that, they say, no, we don't necessarily see that as a good thing, right? So on the one hand, they like their pop culture and, their Avengers movies and their Jay-Z and Ariana Grande, all that sort of stuff, right? But they worry about American culture sort of pushing out their own cultures to some extent. And then just a couple of other questions we've asked about America's role in the world, America's image for respecting individual liberty around the world. This is a question where we ask people, do you think the government of the United States respects the personal freedom of its people? And by and large, again, even in the Trump era when lots of things are kind of negative, people say yes, they think the U.S. government does. However, those numbers are down significantly from a few years ago. And what's a little bit interesting about that trend is that that downward trend actually started in the Obama years. And that might have been, partially the NSA story, could have been some things happening domestically here in the United States. But that's one negative trend regarding American soft power that we've seen in our data, at least, that predates Trump. Is the U.S. doing enough to solve global problems? Is it doing more, less, or about the same as it used to? This is a question we asked last year in our survey, and a plurality in most places said the U.S. is doing less, and that number is particularly high among a lot of America's top allies. And that's hurt U.S. image among some of our key partners around the world. And then just one final thing that we asked in last year's survey is that we asked respondents whether they think it would be better for the world to have the U.S. as the leading power or China as the leading power. And overwhelmingly, people tend to say the United States, even at a moment in which they're not happy with the U.S. in lots of ways. So I think what that tells us is there's a lot of resiliency to America's global image, and that's something we've seen in our data in lots of ways over time. So I'll leave it there. We have lots of other data on these topics, and maybe we're getting cocktails. I'm happy to talk more about it. Right now, I'll hand it over to Jan Mellison. Jan is the co-editor of the Hague Journal of Diplomacy, co-edited this volume. He's also a senior research fellow at the Klingendale Institute, published very widely on the topic of diplomacy. We're very happy to have you here as our moderator tonight. So Jan, I'm going to turn it over to you. Thanks.
I feel extremely honored to have worked with Jay on this special issue, and indeed with such wonderful authors. We have a fantastic cast, and I'd like to, you can say, well, the Hague Journal of Diplomacy, I don't subscribe to that. I advise you not to do so, because university libraries should have it, not individuals. About 700 academic institutions across the world are subscribed to the Hague Journal, but you can get free access to each and every article if you keep an eye on our Twitter handle. What we do is we launch podcasts and videos, and together with that, we release all the articles free for everybody. So I'm not going to talk much longer because I would like to give the floor to our three excellent panelists and indeed involve you as well in the discussions that we are going to have. What the three speakers of tonight have in common, Rhonda Zaharna of American University, Jennifer Brinkerhoff of George Washington University, and Eric Nisbet of Ohio State, is that the three of them have done a lot of academic work, but have also done a lot of consultancy work, advisory work for the executive branch, the legislative branch, for international organizations, NGOs. So I dare say academics who can speak to normal people, who can make themselves understandable to normal people, and who cross the divide without sacrificing academic rigor, rather the contrary, but who have the capability to cross that divide, which, as Jay explained, is also one of the principles behind the operations of CPD in California. What prompted the special issue is the idea, is also the anniversary of CPD, Center on Public Diplomacy in 2018, also the 15th anniversary. It's a magic figure, 15. And we felt that it was time to pull together some of the best thinking, indeed in a more, with shorter, more argumentative articles. The mission of the journal when it comes to public diplomacy is in the future to become both theoretically more rigorous on public diplomacy, methodologically more rigorous, but also be relevant to practitioners. So that's a challenge, and we will keep working towards that. So I would like to ask the panelists, without further ado, to come forward, and all three of you, if that's all fine with you. Okay, thank you. Oh, you're sitting there. Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to follow the order that I was asked to follow, and invite Eric first to speak very briefly on state-sponsored disinformation campaigns, and in this age of technological determinism, to argue for something else.
Well, thank you very much. I want to thank the Pew Research Center. I want to thank the Center for Public Diplomacy at USC for organizing this event, inviting me to be here. This is very exciting, and thank you all for attending. The focus of our article in the special issue, and I think it's part of a larger critique that my author and I have of public diplomacy, both research and practice, is to focus on the demand side of soft power. From my perspective, most of the policy discourse, most of the practice focuses on the supply side when it comes to information content and information campaigns. Looking at what social media content is out there, international broadcasting, public communication campaigns, looking at the content, looking at the distribution, looking at the channels. What I think often is lacking in our understanding of soft power and public diplomacy practice is the demand side, the audience side of the equation, the human side versus the technology or media side. And that is sort of the genesis of our critique. And we use disinformation to argue that, but I think it's something that can be applied more widely. That a lot of our discourse always focuses on the message, but not really understanding what motivates audiences to endorse accurate information or to reject it. What motivates audiences to select certain channels over others, especially what we call in a high choice information environment we have these days, right? Why do some audiences respond to some messages and not others? And I think what we need to do is sort of step back, as Jan said, the technologically deterministic, and more look at the human deterministic, like at the human factors. And why are we vulnerable to, for example, disinformation in this day and age? Why see the rise of sharp power? And many point to the changing sort of information environment, changing technology, but I say, well, yes, though social media has been around for a while. What really has changed? And I think if you look more broadly at sort of the social, economic, political, and cultural changes and threats, especially that we're experiencing in high-income democracies, these are what's making us vulnerable to disinformation and false information. A lot of the research shows that when we're worried, when we're stressed, when we're angry, we're more open to false information. Right? And what's driving sort of these emotional states? What's driving our goals to sort of search out information that makes us feel reassured or just validates who we are, right? Validates our emotions. That actually polarizes us, makes us feel better by making us feel more angry at another group, for example. And so I think we need to sort of step back and think about these human dimensions, these human drivers, because really we're sort of, then if we don't understand the demand side, we're going to make some missteps and have some misperceptions that influence our practice. And I'll give you just a couple examples when it comes to disinformation. For example, a lot of people when they talk about disinformation and state-sponsored disinformation, talk about online echo chambers and social media echo chambers driving disinformation. Well, if you look at the actual academic research that's been published, that's sort of a myth. Actually, we're more divided interpersonally in our interpersonal networks than we are online. We're actually exposed to more diverse information through social media than we are through other information sources, right? In general. And if you look at actually academic research on the relationship between sort of social media use, which we sort of point to the boogeyman of disinformation, right? We show that the relationship shows a very either no relationship at all between social media use and the endorsement of false information, or a weak relationship at best. And even when there is a relationship, when we've done research through not only the United States but also in Europe, we find it varies. In some places, yes, people might be less accurate or endorse false information the more they use social media. In other contexts or other instances, they're more accurate, right, in their beliefs, right, when it comes to rejecting disinformation. So without really understanding the human component and only focusing sort of on the technological, we're going to not necessarily have effective strategies and think about how do we counter sort of the rise of sharp power, right? So I'll just end my comments being short to say that I think our next challenge, I think moving forward as both researchers and practitioners is to look at the demand side of soft power more, right? I think we've sort of focused too much over the last few decades And it's easy to do that. It's in terms of resources and time and effort, often to focus on the information space and on the message and on the content. It's harder to unpack the deeper psychological, social, or contextual factors that drive sort of soft power, whether it's soft power of attraction or basically the sharp power of disassociation and distrust. Right? So I think it's something that we need to think about, more reflective of, and hope that we can maybe talk about in the Q&A. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Eric. Yes, what strikes me in the articles is indeed that we see that there are some surprises. Public diplomacy is no longer as comfortable as we thought it was. Indeed, looking at the receiving end is one of the important things to do. Perhaps also the domestic sphere comes much more into focus. As we know, it was legally separated in this country. Public diplomacy is something you do abroad. And we see that those categories no longer hold as we originally thought they did. In my own teaching, I'm always annoyed by the fact that I'm so trapped by the Westphalian mental maps that are deeply ingrained in my mind. So I'm teaching and talking to my students and discussing with them about diplomatic networking, etc. And I'm always harking back to that perspective that I cannot really escape. That is costing me a lot of effort. And that's what Rhonda has been working on, thinking about how Westphalian principles of thinking about culture perhaps no longer hold, and we have to move, or are perhaps inevitably moving, in another direction. So that's you.
Non-West-West.
Non-West-West.
Start? Okay, thank you. Thank you, Jay, and thank you, Jan, for the opportunity to participate in this exciting project. And also my thanks to the Pew Foundation and the Center for hosting this. When I got the email that the discussion would be on the next generation of soft power, my first reaction was kind of hesitant, because I don't see a next generation of soft power, at least not in its current form. What I do see is a state-centric public diplomacy, including the global competition of soft power, being eclipsed in the near future by humanity-centered diplomacies. And this shift is really from a highly competitive influence strategies to creative and collaborative problem solving. And this shift will require a rethink and retooling of public diplomacy for governments to retain legitimacy and relevancy. And so that's the headline. That's the headline. What I want to talk about are just five interrelated insights on how this shift is going. First, as a shift of thinking from assumptions of separateness to that of interconnectivity. Soft power is very much the product of 19th century and 20th century thinking that envisioned an international system of separate and individual states. And the separatism makes competition and influence and win-lose scenarios not only possible, but optimal. When we move into the dynamics of the 21st century, as many have noted, we're trending toward interconnectivity. Not only is the world more interconnected, it's also more interactive. And soft power in this context is limited if it remains an idea of separateness and competition. And so we need to re-envision soft power from a more relational and interconnected perspectives. Second, and this is tied to the relational interconnected perspective, is there's a gradual shift from state-centric public diplomacy that focuses on the goals and interests of individual states to what I would say is humanity-centered diplomacies that focus on the larger goals of humanity, such as global warming, pandemics, and disparities. Two key functions of these humanity-centered diplomacies are identity mediation and problem solving. And we're already seeing these humanity-centered diplomacies in the rise of public diplomacy in the public interest, public diplomacy for the public good. They've called now everyday diplomacies. And these are diplomacies among people that improve relations, sustainability diplomacies. So while divisions may be capturing the headlines, collaboration is flourishing globally in these new diplomacies. Third, and relatedly, is a shift from culture as the demon to cultural diversity as a potential savior. And today, culture appears to be the demon that divides, that's fueling populism. However, as I write in the paper, the idea of a single national culture is very much a new phenomena and a created phenomena. Culture was termed in 1871. National cultural myths were used to bond very diverse regions of ethnicity and religious groups together under this thing called the state. During the 20th century, mass media was really national media that perpetuated this idea of a national culture. And today we don't even question the idea that culture is a soft power resource. This is a new phenomena. And again, it was a created one. When we look at human history, cultural diversity was long the norm of empires and kingdoms. Cultural diversity was a natural resource of humankind that fueled innovation, development, renaissance. For humanity-centered diplomacies, cultural diversity is a reservoir of different ideas and thinking. It's the savior for innovative problem solving. Fourth is a profound shift in publics from audience to participants. Digital media is turning public diplomacy on its head. It's before the state was the actor and the publics were on the receiving end of that action, either influence or engagement. If you see now, publics through disruption or disruptive actions they're the actors and trying to influence and engage governments. And we can take a cue, corporations are already picking up on this trend. Corporate social responsibility, now they're moving into corporate activism. So they're already picking up. So publics, they've got the tools, they've got the incentive because of the growing severity of problems to act. And they're acting, and they expect governments to act as well and act in the global interests. We see this in the expectation of soft power, the 30 report. And I was just noticing, Richard, on your thing, about acting in the global, to do the right thing for global affairs. You have that up here. They also had it in the soft power report. This was the area that had the largest impact on a perception of countries. It's whether people believe that the country will, quote, do the right thing. And this is significant because public diplomacy may be driven by national interests, but it's the country's conduct in public affairs, or global affairs, that carries the most weight. So fifth and finally, as we move to retooling public diplomacy, currently the focus is on influence strategies. I'd say what we need is to move to strategies for mediating identities, leveraging diversity. We need more sophisticated and creative collaboration strategies in problem solving. Problem solving, I would say, is going to be the new mandate of public diplomacy. So as I conclude, tonight we're talking about soft power. I think we need to pause and think about the larger context. How can we expand soft power from a national competitive level to a global and collaborative level? So thank you. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Rhonda. Rhonda is working on a book for Oxford University Press on global public diplomacy, and I have the impression that's a sort of a lifetime project that gives you wonderful excursions into literatures about diplomacy 5,000 years ago,
Yes.
to the future of non-Western public diplomacy. We share a belief that it's important to look at non-Western diplomacy as well. Arguably, what is a transatlantic consensus about what public diplomacy is, and most of the products, intellectual products published in the English language, does not really correspond with how some countries and some governments see public diplomacy. I think that's also clear from the contribution on China in the special issue. Really a very different understanding of public diplomacy. We see it in the practices of another great power, Russia, that is sort of putting public diplomacy upside down in ways that we didn't expect. So this is a field with many, many surprises ahead. Now our next speaker, Jennifer, is going to talk about diaspora diplomacy, and I had some very stimulating talks at the State Department yesterday, and I came back from those talks with a very clear understanding that's one of the next priorities for the United States also, because the publics are not just abroad, they're also at home, they're in between, and particularly the foreign diaspora in the United States. Well, are they a huge challenge? Are they a huge resource? What about their autonomy? Jennifer has been thinking conceptually and done empirical work on this for many years, and did a book by Cambridge, published by Cambridge University Press in 2009 on diaspora, on digital diaspora. I can confess to you, in 2009, digital was not on my radar. So Jennifer, over to you.
Thank you so much. I want to add my thanks to the organizers, and what a privilege it is to be here tonight. As Jan mentioned, I've been studying the role of diasporas in public affairs since 2001. It was actually sparked by September 11th and the way that publics mobilized after that. I saw that there were some Americans who were mobilizing for the first time around an Afghan-American identity because of new opportunities in their country of origin to create change for the good. And I thought there's really got to be something here that is broader. And of course, just as you were saying about the historical perspective that Rhonda is incorporating into her book, you discover that, you know, this diaspora thing is not new. I think we all know that intuitively. But I think that we have not been aware of just how mobilized diasporas have been, how active they've been in public diplomacy and economic development and in security in a range of fields. And so it's really been a fascinating journey to study all of these groups. So it was a wonderful opportunity to be able to put my learnings over the last couple of decades into this new frame of thinking about what are the implications for public diplomacy, both today but also in the future. And it's fascinating to hear Rhonda's presentation and just think about immediately how I think the diaspora experience and engagement is basically accelerating all of the things that you have mentioned. And so I think that's a particular area that's going to be interesting to watch. So what do diasporas do in public diplomacy? I argue that there's basically three ways that diasporas can become engaged in diplomacy. As agents in their own right, with their own agendas, as instruments of the agendas of others, whether that is a conscious engagement or not on the part of diasporas, right? They are also publics that can be manipulated and engaged for various purposes. But somewhat relatedly, but very important to distinguish, diasporas can also be very important partners in public diplomacy. And that may happen intentionally or accidentally when we realize that we are mobilizing perhaps in uncoordinated ways, but in ways that demonstrate shared interests. And so I think there's an enormous opportunity to engage diasporas for very positive outcomes, generally, excuse me. But we also have to think about, well, why diasporas? What's different about diasporas? So in the piece, I try to outline some of the ways that diasporas are distinct in the way that they engage in public diplomacy. And I discuss 3 of those. The first one is that the diaspora identity itself can result in specific applications for which diasporas play a unique role. And since we've been talking about the State Department, I will actually quote from somebody from the State Department. It was former U.S. Undersecretary of State for Democracy and Global Affairs, Maria Otero, who put it this way at one of the State Department's first ever diaspora summits. She said this: "What the State Department might call diplomacy is what you might think of as a phone call home. For those of us who come from a different country, foreign relations is family relations." And in this sense, diasporas really are unique because they are engaging in their everyday lived experience in a form of public diplomacy. I don't know of any other actors where we can make that assumption. And it doesn't apply to all migrants, by the way. It's those people or immigrants. It's those people who are engaged both in the United States and connecting to their countries of origin. So that diaspora identity is a very important mobilizer. And as I mentioned in the opening of my remarks, sometimes it can be a latent thing that gets mobilized because there is some perceived threat or opportunity to that diaspora identity. And so we see the Afghan Americans mobilizing for the first time around an Afghan identity after September 11th. But we also see, interestingly, when Starbucks wanted to usurp the cultural identity names of Ethiopian coffee regions, the Ethiopian American diaspora mobilized in very, very important ways. They partnered with Oxfam and with NGOs, and they connected through these professional networks that had Ethiopian Americans placed in strategic locations, not for this purpose, they just happened to be working there, on the Hill, at the IMF, in the State Department, you know, all over. And so they knew how to organize a campaign and how to make it meaningful. They won that battle. First, Starbucks voluntarily said, okay, we're hands off on your trade. We will not trademark those brands. And then it was later legalized. So that's a very interesting example, I find, that is unique to a diaspora in terms of what may be mobilized around these identity constructs about home. A second area that makes them distinct is the diasporans' responses to global crises of identity and inequity. And so as Rhonda was exploring, you know, we're no longer thinking just about a Westphalian system. And so a crisis of identity, as Manuela Castells writes about in terms of global identity crises, is when a particular identity group may feel marginalized from the power structures. Well, in today's world, we are not limited to a nation state, and we see diasporans engaging with more than one state government. And as my example just now illustrates, it's also with NGOs, with international bodies, with many non-state actors. And so that is a distinct, it's perhaps not as distinct to diasporas, but it's an important aspect of diaspora public diplomacy. In terms of inequity, one of the things that I find most interesting, and my area of specialization is actually international development, and that's why I was interested in the role of diasporas. And one of the motivators that we see among diasporas that is crucial to economic development globally and especially in their countries and places of origin is that they see that they experience in diaspora opportunities, institutions, benefits, services that their family members and their compatriots back in the country of origin don't have. So they are living inequity in a transnational sense on a daily basis. And this becomes a motivating factor for their engagement. I find this particular element quite fascinating, and it really does demonstrate the potential to engage these groups. And I also argue that when one is motivated around identity issues instead of just material ones, then that motivation is likely to be deeper and more sustained over time. The third distinction is that diasporas may have a particular, what I call, in-between advantage. And this is the subtitle of my more recent book from 2016, where I talk about the diaspora in-between advantage for institutional reform. And in that context, we see that diasporans are bridging between two contexts, and they often speak the language and can make those connections across those two contexts. So that is an important one. Another element of the in-between advantage is being able to operate by exception. So engaging in one area and not having to follow all the social norms because actually you're from that identity, but you're a little different. You're also American. So you're Ethiopian, but you're also American. So you get to navigate and hedge those identities. So in the interest of time, let me just get to my final remarks, and I apologize if I'm taking too long. In terms of thinking about the future, obviously complexity will continue, and I think Rhonda's done a great job of outlining that. I will say that we don't even yet have a language, those of us who have been studying the diaspora phenomenon, we don't even have a language yet to describe how the diaspora experience is evolving. We now have a lot of people who go back to their country of origin, and there's also a lot of circular migration. Well, how do we think about those individuals? Are they still from the diaspora when they've moved back home? Are they from the diaspora in segmented ways as they move between places? So there's a lot still that we need to work out on that front. Also, some of the existing literature on the diaspora public diplomacy phenomenon has talked about, do diasporas have the right to speak for publics? And I took great umbrage to that because I don't think we ever do that for other populations to say, do they have a right to speak? People will speak, people will engage, right? So I guess my final pitch would just be that we need to do a better job of integrating diasporas into our existing frameworks for thinking about public diplomacy. We don't necessarily need new frameworks, we need enriched ones. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. Thank you. The landscape is changing so fast, the public diplomacy landscape, that I'm happy to be on the side of think tankers and academics rather than practitioners who have to make decisions where to put their resources because prioritizing may be quite a tall order. Eric?
No, I just wanted to add to what Zaharna said about problem-solving public diplomacy. We don't use the same terminology, but we conclude with that in an article. When it comes to disinformation, well, what's the relationship between problem-solving diplomacy and disinformation? And what we would argue in our research is that the primary drivers of endorsement of disinformation, we're finding this empirically, especially in looking at Western Europe, looking at political disinformation or Russian disinformation in the US, it's not necessarily like social media, it is underlying economic anxiety, it is democratic dissatisfaction, it is support for authoritarian governance, it's perceptions of cultural threat, the rise of anti-globalism. These are the structural vulnerabilities that lead to people believing in disinformation when they feel fearful, anxious, worried, angry. We're more open to false information. That's the basis of a lot of psychological research.
Is it, Eric, is it deliberate that you did not use the term fake news?
I mean, fake news is one flavor of disinformation. I think if you look at the research, there is multiple flavors. When I talk about disinformation, that it's just to say that, I think to finish up my thought with Zaharna, is that she's talking about problem-solving public diplomacy. And I think the best way to solve disinformation is to focus on problem-solving public diplomacy that addresses these underlying vulnerabilities, right? If we until we do that, disinformation problem is not going to go away. It's going to be basically a game of whack-a-mole, right? We're using different technology, we'll censor here, we'll change the algorithm, but we're not going to fundamentally, and we'll focus on the supply side. We're not going to fundamentally address the demand side. There's going to be people who are motivated, who want to believe this false information, who seek it out. And so until we have problem-solving public diplomacy is the best way to do that at a macro level, right, strategically versus tactically. And that's my point. I think that's where sort of both are trying to create connections between our two work. Okay. I think that's where it connects.
That's great. Thank you very much, Eric. I'd like to open up to the floor and ask for questions and, of course, also comments.
Absolutely, and some embassies are pretty good at it. So in the example that I gave about Starbucks, the Ethiopian embassy was very engaged. They brought people from government officials from Ethiopia to work with the diaspora on this campaign. So I think, and I know because we have on our faculty the former ambassador from Tanzania, who's with us in our Institute for African Studies, and she, when she was ambassador, was really prioritized building a community around the Tanzanian diaspora, and that's part of how you listen. You build a community, you help them, so you're providing a service to connect them, and then it's an opportunity to listen to what their concerns are, but also communicate what the government's concerns are so that they might then call their senator, right? So it is a mutual engagement that I think is very worthwhile to invest in.
Thank you. I can imagine that if you looked at other countries as well, that you've come across other countries that are good at diaspora diplomacy in one way or another. Could you give one example of one of the stars outside the United States?
Oh, in terms of how they're
of engaging with their diaspora.
Okay, so we now have diaspora ministries. We have complete diaspora frameworks in policy frameworks in a lot of different countries. So I think most of you would be familiar from some of them that appear more in the news. So I happen to have studied the Ethiopian diaspora in great depth, as well as their government engagement, but we also find it in India, right? Where India has a whole identity card, where governments give the opportunity of their diasporans to vote in elections. I mean, that's a really huge thing that used to be perceived as a big threat. And a lot of diasporas mobilized really strongly to try to get the vote. And what's interesting is what the studies have shown is once they got the vote, they didn't necessarily exercise it. So voting rates are really low. And this is what the point I was trying to make about the mobilizing impact of identity. It's like you want the validation that you're part of a community, that you're connected, but you don't necessarily have to vote. So this is, there are many countries that are at different stages of this, and I'd rather not bore you with one.
Not rank them.
So.
Not say Israel's first or whatever.
Well, no, because they're all very different.
That's right.
Israel's the oldest. Israel's definitely the oldest, but China is pretty good.
Absolutely.
Oh, China is very good. Especially, they had a huge campaign to try to bring back some of their skilled diasporans.
So the diaspora as a resource.
Yes, skilled people, and they don't want them to move back permanently. They want them to partner with Chinese universities so that they're engaging not just a partnership with that Chinese national overseas, but also with the institution where they teach, right? So there's some really smart things happening in the world.
Digital networks in diaspora.
Well, Nick has written a lot on listening. And
Nick Cole.
Nick Cole, sorry. Nick Cole at USC has written a lot on listening. Jennifer, I'm thinking about, you're talking now about listening. We've got to take it to the next level, perspective taking. And this is happening also, I'm thinking about in the corporate, it's not just perspective taking, empathetic listening and response, because the more crises we start seeing with these global problems, going out and not responding in an empathetic, that's one, learning more on response skills, because a lot about public diplomacy is how to get the message out, but not how to respond. that's a whole thing. Working on response skills, empathetic listening, crisis response skills, and then also the identity mediation. You talk about, I'm still torn between, yes, there's a thing of culture is so strongly attached, but then it's so diffused, and also identity is so multiple. And when you've got states smacking like that, that's one thing. But usually when people interact, all these different layered identities start coming out. So learning identity mediation, identity and conflict. So that's the one, and then of course the problem solving, and that's a skill. We're actually doing it at the university. I'm at AU, and one of the new courses that we've instigated, or it's not instigated, started. One of the courses that we've started is complex problems. And before, the way that you used to, problems were solved linear. They see the problem, they study it, they develop a plan, they implement the plan, problem solved, and then maybe evaluation. What we're doing now at the university and in the course is that the thing with complex problems is they're so complex, when you start to solve one aspect, you create another, and then that leads to another. And so in the complex problem, we're teaching the students how to work collaboratively, and these courses generally have 3 professors working together so we can get different perspectives, and then we lead with it's just being uncomfortable with ambiguity, and so it's a whole different technique of how to look at problems and think about problems in different ways. I think you're sitting next to a public relations. We are training that in public communication. Spokespersons have to be able to have empathy for their audience. I mean, if you've just had a disaster and we're here to report the statistics on this, no, the first thing is our heart goes out to you. So it's training in that, not just the official response, but an empathetic response.
And can I add to that a little bit? So I think it's also about just a better understanding of human behavior. So as I mentioned, I teach international development, and I'm always using that point of reference that, in international development management, we are teaching our students about the importance of participatory processes and a sense of ownership. And while I don't mention this example in this particular article, one of my favorite examples of a major blunder of diaspora engagement was actually, and I have a great deal of respect for Andrew Natsios, who was the USAID agency director under Bush W. Great respect for him, but this was a blunder because after the US invaded Iraq, he went to the Midwest to try to engage with the Iraqi American diaspora. And the plan that they had was to say, we know you care about your friends and family back in Iraq. We know that you care about your country of origin. So we've designed these projects so that you can contribute to rebuilding. And so we've launched this website. And if you want to support education, click here and donate to contribute to this project. If you want to do something in the environment, click here. It was horrible because they didn't recognize that the way that you motivate people is that you invite them to co-develop, to co-design the initiative. Then they will buy into it. Then they will feel like it's their idea. They'll commit to it. And so it was disrespectful. They didn't raise any money. It was a huge blunder. So anyway, just those kinds of skills.
Yeah. Okay. So following up from empathy, understanding your audience is a huge task in how audiences communicate. And that's where we go to Eric.
Yeah. Right, and I want to echo everything that's been said, understanding your audience and principles. And I would say, and now working with the Center for Public Diplomacy for several years, working on training public diplomacy professionals, both at their summer institute. We've done it in Europe, we do it in DC. So I've worked with a couple hundred now over the last few years, probably collectively, and also working with the State Department on some projects, some research projects. I think one of the things moving forward and one of the challenges, because it is a challenge in terms of time and resource, is what I call evidence-based public diplomacy. We talk about evidence-based medicine.
Yeah.
Well, why don't we have evidence-based PD? Right? And that's both in terms of the, not only the evaluation, the back-end evaluation, which we also talk about, but it's also the front-end evaluation, right? The planning, understanding, what is the message, understanding human behavior. And part of that is not only the evidence, is also understanding some theories of change we talk about, right? Like, as what your example is, how do we get to from A to B to C? What is the theory of change? What's the underlying principles and drivers that's going to achieve our campaign, our goal? We need to have a better understanding of teaching that up front, because sometimes we just do to do, right? Or you get a mandate to do something and you don't even understand maybe why you're doing it, but you have to do it, right? So we need to think about how we design public diplomacy programs, what is the underlying assumptions and principles and theories of change, that how we're going to get to our goals, and what is the evidence to that will help us design them and evaluate them. And so I think a more evidence-based paired with understanding human behavior, as you mentioned, is something that we need to do. But it is a challenge for practitioners. You don't have the time, you don't have the resources. So part of that is managing up and educating your organizations, your supervisors, your colleagues about the importance of that and why it's needed, right? So that is a challenge for you, and we understand that, but I think that's something we need to think about.
Okay. Yeah, sorry. I want to just touch on your examples, Jennifer. An area that is a wide open area that hasn't been explored a lot is emotion. And this was when we were working on the German project, and that just opened my eyes up to how the whole area of emotion is not so much in the Western diplomacies, but very, very prominent just in the rest of the world. And just that example of Iraq, going there and talking about buying and having ownership, it was devastating for the people to have their country. Baghdad was the city of peace. So just devastated by that. What Japan did in its public diplomacy, it realized that the people were traumatized. And so it developed a public diplomacy and realizing that pride, trying to influence pride and reinstill pride after being traumatized, and did a program on soccer. And so that the Iraqi people could see their team playing again and having a sense of pride. But that emotional element is just a wide open element that needs more exploration.
I agree.
Jay, if you are tempted to comment on that one, you're more than welcome. Or
I can speak to it.
I'm working with Jay on our
we all work with Jay.
Jay and I have been working on a project for several years now, looking at empirically based impact of exchange programs. And I'm sure we'd be happy if allowed to provide some of that information publicly in the future. But right now it's been more private. But we've been looking at the local impact of exchange programs, not so much on the participants, but on the communities which host them, right? On the citizens, on the local organizations, on the resources. And we found it does have a meaningful impact in terms of workforce development, encouraging greater community integration and valuing diversity, understanding local migrant populations better, because local community organizations have then interacted with people from foreign countries or organizations. So it has a wide-ranging sort of economic, cultural, and sort of community building impact on local communities based upon this project we've been working on. So I think it's forthcoming. We have to refine our techniques. It's in its infant stages. I think there needs to be more capacity building to do these empirical empirical-based studies with our local organizations in the United States, for example, many of the nonprofits and others that host these exchanges and work with the exchanges. I think we need to do a better job of helping them measure impact and invest in that infrastructure. But I think it is something that is emerging, and we definitely have evidence that it has a positive impact on our communities, and that's something I think we look forward to sharing moving forward. Jay wants to add to that.
Yeah, it's also perhaps a very good example of a very strategic kind of public diplomacy, isn't it, the exchanges? Jay, yeah, over to you.
So if you look at the exchanges, so the fundamental things about exchanges is there are basically two things. One is there is this physical interaction, and it's also bidirectional. And if we believe physical interaction is essential, or it is becoming even more important, given our everyday lives are more in this more techno world, because we have seen that in other spheres where you would think digital interaction should replace a lot of the physical interaction, which is not the case, because then I always argue physical interaction, the physical presence is the communal aspect. It's fundamentally human, but certainly in other types of living animals has that too. So then how do you sort of capture that? And how do you capture that by directional aspect? Because in all these situations, there are three network scenarios that you create. You create a cross-country network. You create a network that's based on the local networks that's based on the participants from the country of origin. You also create the network of the hosting communities that interact with them. So what we don't have a good understanding is that what's the nature of these networks and what is the value of these networks? So we believe that networks are assets. Networks can be very powerful in this sort of a digital information space. We've seen plenty of examples how networks work in misinformation, because we have bad examples, a lot of that, where it works spectacularly. We don't have good examples of how few examples, in our public diplomacy space, that how good things, public diplomacy work, gets spread or gets motivated, activated through this, because we don't understand the nature of the network, and then we haven't been mapping out this network, and we don't have a sense of what's the true value and how that value would contribute to our strategic goal. And this is actually the area where that we are trying to really move forward, because I think we have experts. We have a professor from University of Maryland who does a lot on these networks. We've seen this work in other spheres, but we just haven't seen it actually done in a very solid, rigorous way in public diplomacy. And I think there are many opportunities to do that.
Thanks very much, Jeff. Very interesting line of research and practice.
Can I respond to that for a second? I think that's fabulous. I think it's really important to try to come up with these metrics. I think networks are really important. But I would just caution, because I think a lot of what happens with public diplomacy, it's not all transactional. And when you start looking at it in terms of mapping out networks, it has a really transactional feel. And it's almost like we did a complete 180 from what we were just talking about in terms of human behavior and values and emotions, and now we're talking about quantitative measures and networks. Both are important for sure, engaging impact. But one of my academic hero was Albert Hirschman, and he had a fabulous theory about the storing and mutation of social energy. That what might at first appear to be a failure actually in the long run proves to be a great success. He studied all of these grassroots investments that the Inter-American Foundation made in Latin America, and he found that those initial initiatives had all failed. But when he went down there and studied it in depth, he found that the people who were involved in those failures went on to found new things that had great impact. So when we measure impact of public diplomacy, makes all the difference in the world, if you do in the short run or the long run. But also, attribution will always be difficult. And so I just think we shouldn't raise expectations that we're going to quantify the results of public diplomacy, because I don't think it's possible or meaningful.
Okay, thank you very much, Jennifer.
When I was looking at, as John said, I was looking at different types of diplomacies, and including the ancient diplomacies. And one was the Aramana diplomacy, which was in ancient Mesopotamia and Egypt. And in looking at the distinguishing features, very relational, and it's the nature of the relational bond that influenced the communication. Here in the States, when we study communication, it's the message medium. It's of Lasserfield's that who says what to whom with what effect, very much influence. Looking at the relational dimension, the dimensions that stood out, one was the contact event or the contact person. There had to be an official contact. Second was co-presence. That was a thing that you were talking, because there had to be that nonverbal aspect of gauging. A third was emotion. There was an emotional dimension. Love was actually part of the diplomacy. It was between this royal brotherhood of kings. Another one was reciprocity. Very strict reciprocity in terms of exchanges. Perspective taking. This was another dimension, and another was symbolism. It wasn't that direct thing. So these were the dimensions, whereas in the messages and medium and influence, those have specific points. Looking at public diplomacy or diplomacy from a relational, these were the critical factors.
Right.
So.
Thank you very much. Inspiring reading about the ancient Near East,
I
right?
love it.
Diplomacy
very cool.
was non-Western, was non-state, was relational, was cross-cultural. It's a huge resource.
My brief answer is I think possibly one way, and not the only way, and I'm not sure how successful it will be, but one way is more governmental academic partnerships. A lot of academics have the training, they have maybe the more larger vision, they can provide context to programs. It's something we've discussed over time. So I think, and something that when I've encountered and trained public diplomacy diplomats at training sessions, we've discussed, and they're very interested and hungry for. So I think more academic and practitioner partnerships on projects where basically they can create a synergy that imparts some training, provides some insights from both sides of the equation, and that hopefully improve the overall quality of our public diplomacy practice. So I think more of that moving forward in different forms, I think it might be helpful.
I think we also need much more systematic and higher quality storytelling and collection of critical incidents. So most evaluation systems start by identifying what the indicators are a priori, but there's a lot of innovation happening in evaluation where instead we want to listen more, which is what public diplomacy is all about, listen for those impactful stories and the critical incidents that illustrate the theory of change. So you still have to start with a well-articulated theory of change.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
I would say, given the interconnectivity, when relations, I think we got to move to building relations for relationships' sake. And other countries do that. And this was a non-Western perspective and what I saw in the ancient and also I see in the future. And maybe just having part of a budget, or since I have lots of money, having part of a budget that's not going to be measured, but having relations having relations for relationships' sake and the sake of just better relations.
Thank you very much, all three of you. What I'm taking back from this discussion is I want to think harder about how to bridge the gap between academia and practice and practitioners, which I think is such an important enterprise. So important for us to do that without doing concessions to the quality of academic work. And I think that's also a good thing of the mission of the Center on Public Diplomacy. I would like to thank Richard very much and the Pew Research Center. I'm sorry the sun is shining right. Well, it's a good thing now that I'm talking about you. The sun is blinding you. It's really, thanks very much for hosting us. I'm hoping that the Hague Journal of Diplomacy, in terms of brand recognition, will reach the 1% of your worldwide fame. That would make me very, very happy. I would like to thank the audience, and I hope we can continue our discussions next door where there are drinks and snacks. And thank you so much for coming. Thank you all, panelists. Yeah.